Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for another fascinating segment of the Sefarad legacy. A few program notes before we get started. Please note that on this webinar, we do not use the chat button and ask that you please send your questions and comments to the Q&A button on your screen. We will try to address these questions at the Q&A session at the end of the event, where all the speakers will be present to answer and discuss your questions. Please ask that you please include your email address at the bottom of your question, just in case we are not able to address your particular question during this live event. And now let's get started. My name is Michael Steinberger, and I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a platform dedicated to promoting the story of Sefarad to the world at large. Our alliance brings together global organizations, institutions, and individuals covering the private and public sectors, thereby creating a voice of the collective, allowing us to broaden our scope and expand our reach. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge and thank today's co-hosting partners for helping us make this event a success. I would like to welcome and thank Congregation Mikveh Israel of Philadelphia, a new co-hosting partner. Welcome. The Sefardic Heritage International DC, or SHIN DC, our newest co-hosting partner. Welcome to you too. Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center, the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, and the Museum of the Jewish People, the Hadassah Brandeis Institute of Brandeis University, Fundación Hispano-Judaya, or the Hispanic Jewish Foundation of Madrid, Kulanu, the Society of Crypto-Judaic Studies, the European Jewish Community Center, American Sephardic Federation and its Institute of Jewish Experience, the Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies and the Feldenkrais Program, Judaic Studies, both at the University of Miami, Reconectar, Centro de Estudos Judaicos de Trás-os-Montes in Portugal, and last but not least, the Jewish Learning Channel. Today's webinar offers a glimpse into the Sefarad influence in America. Bringing this segment of Sefarad experience to life are four special guest speakers, including Professor Jonathan Sarna, Professor Paul Fingelman, Mr. Keith Stokes, and Attorney at Law Eli Gabay. The moderator today is our own Dr. Isaac Amon, and welcome remarks are delivered by Mr. Warren Klein. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Mr. Warren Klein to everyone. Mr. Klein has been the curator of the Herbert and Eileen Bernard Museum of Judaica Temple Emmanuel since 2013. His exhibitions have included graphic posters, contemporary Jewish wedding gowns, Golda Meir, and most recently, Jews and Chocolate. Previously, he worked at JTS Library, Skirball Museum at Los Angeles, Magnus Museum in Berkeley, and several private collections in New York. He holds an MA in Jewish art from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a BA in the history of art from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Take it away, Warren.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. I wanted to talk a little bit about the exhibition that we have up right now in our Bernard Museum here at Temple Emmanuel. It is called At the Crossroads of Sefarad, in the Footsteps of the Crypto Jews. It was organized by ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People, and Jewish Heritage Alliance. It is a first of its kind capsule or didactic exhibition exploring the history of the Jews on the Iberian Peninsula, their expulsion, conversion, and legacy. We are proud to be the first venue of this inaugural partnership, and we were able to make the exhibition our own by using original objects from our own collection to help illustrate the narrative, as well as some rare books and manuscripts on loan to us from the Hebrew Union College Clow Library. The exhibition will be on view through August 28th of this year, and we would invite anyone in the New York area to come visit. No appointment necessary. We're open Sunday through Thursday, 10 to 4, and you can visit the emmanuelnyc.org/museum for more information or to arrange a tour. And it's my pleasure to throw it back to Michael.
Thank you, Warren, for your welcome remarks and for sharing the news of our mobile exhibit that made its USA and global debut at your museum. Thank you very much. And now, I have the privilege to introduce our very own Dr. Isaac Amon, Director of Academic Research and Program Development at Jewish Heritage Alliance, to provide a brief background for today's webinar and to introduce today's speakers. Take it away, Isaac.
Today's program will introduce you to the Jewish Heritage Alliance series, Legacy of Sefarad in America. To clarify from the outset, the webinar today focuses on the early arrival and development of the first American Jewish communities. It's noteworthy to mention that official Jewish arrival was preceded by the presence of conversos, or new Christians, descendants of Jews forcibly converted to Catholicism in the Iberian Peninsula in previous centuries. Many of these conversos tried to hold on to their Jewish traditions in secret and are thus referred to as hidden, secret, or crypto Jews. These descendants of Jews came to North America, especially the American Southwest and Florida, well before the arrival of the communal Jews of whom we speak today. While both form part of the Sefarad story, history makes a distinction between crypto Jews who maintained fidelity to their ancestral rituals, traditions, and faith amidst fear of inquisitorial persecution, and the earliest communities of openly professing Jews. And therefore, the birth of communal Jewish life in North America, as we will learn today, is traditionally dated to 1654 in the Dutch colony of New Netherland, the future New York. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed growing numbers of Sephardic Jews who settled in port cities along the Atlantic seaboard, where they founded Spanish and Portuguese synagogues and communities, several of which endure to this day, including Congregation Shearith Israel in New York City, Congregation Jeshuat Israel in Newport, Rhode Island, and Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When the founders of the nascent American Republic drafted the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights, landmark historical, political, and legal documents of the late 18th century, they were aware of this long-standing Jewish presence, some of whom had fought for the young nation's freedom. Indeed, the fact that the new republic came to prohibit religious tests for public office and guaranteed the free exercise of religion reflected a remarkable development in the history of the rights of man. Yet the new nation's commitment to religious liberty, especially for Jews, was epitomized by President George Washington's 1790 letters to Hebrew congregations on the East Coast, most famously in Newport, Rhode Island. The first president of the Republic affirmed liberty of conscience to be an inherent natural right and declared that the government of the United States would give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, thus assuring religious liberty for the children of the stock of Abraham. From George Washington's time until our own, this remarkable history has profoundly shaped American Jewish life. It is now my great honor to introduce today's four distinguished speakers, beginning with our keynote presenter, Dr. Jonathan Sarna, who is widely recognized and respected as one of the foremost experts on early American Jewish history. He serves as university professor, the Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History, and director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. He is chief historian of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia and a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Jonathan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. It is a great pleasure to be with everybody. And my job is to give a grand summary. And I think the place to start is really with the events of 530 years ago, when Jews were ordered to leave Spain by the last day of July, the day before the fast day of Tisha B'Av. Those Jews went in many directions, which is why the diaspora of Sephardic Jews, of Iberian refugees is so broad. You can see on your screen those many directions, and there at the top left, you see towards America. But actually, America played a very significant role in the thinking of Sephardic Jews following the expulsion, who were trying to make sense of what had happened, how could God have allowed it? What could it possibly mean? And one of the most important figures who helped Jews understand a possible explanation for the expulsion was Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, a towering philosopher and activist who wrote a highly important book entitled Mikveh Israel. And he, in a sense, gave new hope to those who had been expelled, suggesting that their expulsion really formed part of the birth pangs of the Messiah. And you can see quotes on your screen. What I particularly want you to see is what it says at the bottom. The Lord has promised that he will gather the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, out of the four quarters of the world, whence you may gather that for the fulfilling of that, they must be scattered through all the corners of the world. And this appears now to be done when our synagogues are found in America. In other words, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel linked the coming of Jews to the New World, initially Recife in Brazil, and later through the Caribbean and into North America. He linked that to the birth pangs of the Messiah, to the prophecy that the Messiah would come when Jews were literally scattered to the four corners of the world. It is no accident that the most popular name for synagogue in the New World was Mikveh Israel, Mikveh Israel. In North America, we see it in Philadelphia, in Savannah, and we see some others in the New World as well. This was an indicator that in addition to the business lives of the Sephardic diaspora, they also imagined that they were part of a great messianic, mystical development. They were making possible the coming of the Messiah by reaching North America. Now, Sephardic Jews initiated remarkable worldwide trade. This is now much studied, and you can get a sense of it from this map, where you see how it literally reaches all of the different continents, and it embraces a wide range of different commodities in different places. And the Sephardic Jews, with their vast network of traders, really helped introduce people to new products from other continents in the world. It's an enormously important contribution to the economy of the New World. Our concern today, of course, is simply with those who reached North America, especially following the expulsion of Jews from Recife after it was recaptured by the Portuguese and the Dutch, and that explains the coming of Jews to New York City. And then one can see that Jews settled really in 5 major port cities, from Savannah in the south to Newport in the north. These dates next to them are when congregations seem to have been established. Some of the dates are disputed. Note well that Jews did not even settle in every port city. Jews tended to settle in cities where there was a heterogeneous population, where they were not the only outgroup. Boston, which was the most homogeneous community in North America, did not seem like a welcoming spot for Jews, and they didn't settle there. The Jews, unlike the vast majority of our colonial figures, the Jews settled in port cities where they could trade and where they could trade with others, both in the New World and back in the Old World, and we call them port Jews. Port Jews, like court Jews, are a special kind of early modern Jew. They are merchants. Their world is dominated by business and commerce, but of course, there's no contradiction between spending your business life in commerce and also engaging in religious and even mystical experiences. And it's often in these port cities where we find anticipation of ideas about modernity that will only reach Europe a century or two later. The idea that Judaism is synagogue-based. We're emphasizing faith, the immersion in the larger Christian culture. All of the port cities saw Jews immersed in the world around them rather than living in what European Jews would call a ghetto or cut off from non-Jews. All of the port cities saw a wide range of Jews, some very assimilated, some very observant. And all of them saw what we might say is segmented Jewish life and identity. I might be Aaron and deeply religious in my synagogue, and Duarte and a merchant in my business life. As I said earlier, American synagogue names are our best evidence that that commercial side of the Sephardic diaspora is linked and complemented by a messianic hope. Every one of these names relates to a biblical verse promising that the Messiah will soon come. Mikveh Israel, Shearith Israel, Nidchei Israel, Jeshuat Israel. It is no accident that they chose those names. That's what explained the trauma of the expulsion. That's what provided these Jews so far from their roots and so far from the majority of Jews across the ocean. That's what provided them with hope. But we have other evidence too of their messianism from non-Jews who live near Jews. The most famous and distinguished of the ministers in North America, Jonathan Edwards, later in Massachusetts. Jonathan Edwards writes that he lived next door to a Jew when he spent some months in New York in 1722. And since privacy wasn't so well known in those days, he spent time observing his Jewish neighbor, and he describes, this is what Jews call a real Kiddush Hashem, the honoring of their divine name. He described his Jewish neighbor as the devoutest person that ever I saw in my life. Great part of his time being spent in acts of devotion at his eastern window, which opened next to mine and of course faced Jerusalem, seeming to be most earnestly engaged, not only in the daytime, but sometimes whole nights. A very rare example of what Jews call tikkun chatzot, or some of the nightly mystical devotions that were instituted by those who left Spain. We know many of them from Safavid mystics, but here we see a Sephardic Jew who by day is a merchant, but by night he is praying for the Messiah. The late Professor Hershkowitz, looking at maps of who lived where, identified the person as the merchant, Jacob Lusada. Similarly, here looking at a group, Ezra Stiles, the well-known Protestant minister of Newport, later the president of Yale University, described in 1769 that there was a great thunderstorm in Newport, and instead of closing the windows to keep the rain out, the Jews threw open doors, windows, and employed themselves in singing and repeating prayers for meeting Messiah. That is remarkable, and it reflects a very old mystical idea described by the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem. It relates to the expectation Jews had of being transported on the clouds of heaven back to the land of Israel. And Professor Scholem listed many examples of that idea. He did not know of Ezra Stiles, but here we see how a mystical idea made its way with the Sephardic exiles to the New World, and we see a non-Jew testifying to the hope of these Jews that the Messiah would bring them back to the land of Israel, out of the diaspora. Much more could be said on that theme, but I want to turn now to the American Revolution, which transforms the Sephardic communities of the colonial era. For one thing, it cuts them off from many of those commercial networks that we earlier saw, and it really transforms the economy of North America and therefore their economy. But let's look at what we learn about the revolution and Jews. This is a brand new discovery. Recently, the diary of the Reverend Moses Allen of Savannah was discovered, and it contained a remarkable notice. Reverend Allen was imprisoned by the British when they occupied Savannah, and so was Mordecai Sheftel, who was one of the Jews who remained in Savannah. Mordecai Sheftel, we should make clear, was himself of Ashkenazi background, but the Savannah community had been founded by Sephardic Jews and maintained the Sephardic practice. In any case, Reverend Allen tells us that when the British served pork to the prisoner, the Jews, Mr. Sheftel and son, meaning Mordecai and his son, whose first name was Sheftel, Mordecai Sheftel and Sheftel refused to eat their pieces. They wouldn't eat the pork. And the British greased their knives and forks, which were their private property, with pork as punishment directed to the Jew. And the Reverend Allen writes, it is a happiness that Mr. Sheftel is a fellow sufferer. He bears it with such fortitude as is an example to me. And here we have an proof of Jews observing some of the laws of kashrut, even in prison. And by the way, as we'll see in a minute, Mordecai Sheftel survived this trauma. He's later traded and goes free. Now, the revolution caused great difficulty to Sephardic Jews. Chazan Isaac Turo of the Newport synagogue, Jeshuat Israel, was exiled. He supported the British. He felt that the Newport Jews depended on that trade. Britain had been good to Newport. He supported them. He has to leave when the revolution wins. He goes to the Caribbean, and tragically, at only 45 years of age, he dies in the Caribbean. Then his sons, Abraham and Judah, come back to North America, brought up in Boston by their uncle. Both go on to remarkable careers, one in Boston, one in New Orleans. But the theme is exile in the wake of the revolution. Here it's exile from all of North America, but to Aaron Lopez, it was simply exile from Newport. He was the largest taxpayer and one of the leading citizens of Newport, one of its most successful merchants, engaged in a wide range of trades. When the revolution comes, he is exiled to Leicester. He suffers enormous losses because the whole network that he had set up for his trade is destroyed, really, by the revolution. With the end of the revolution, he hoped to return to Newport, to his home, and to rebuild his business, but tragically, he drowned on the way back. We have many of his papers, perhaps more than for any other colonial merchant. But again, the theme of exile and an economic dislocation. The revolution also leads to loss of life. Frances Sheftel, who was the wife of Mordecai Sheftel, whom we met earlier, wrote a letter to her husband, and she revealed, we have had no less than 6 Jewish children buried since the siege, this being the British siege of Savannah, and a reminder that Jews were among those who suffered during the revolution. And it's not just exile and loss, but indeed there is also destruction. Here we see Samson Mears, who had gone and exiled with quite a few other Jews to Norwalk, Connecticut. They thought that they would be safe in Norwalk, but instead there was a terrible battle and indeed Norwalk was burned. And the Jews, along with all of the other refugees in Norwalk and citizens of Norwalk, lost a great deal. And Samson Mears noted this was what he calls the anniversary season, meaning the period of time between the 17th of the month of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, the 3 weeks that is the anniversary of the period of the destruction of the temple, the saddest period in the Jewish calendar. And he noticed that it was precisely in this sad anniversary season that once again there was a terrible burning and fire and battle, and he really lost a great many of his possessions. But fortunately, the revolution ended, the British withdrew, and once again, we turn to a letter that survives from Mordecai Sheftel of Savannah, writing to his son, "Thanks to the Almighty, it is now at an end." And he predicted so very wisely, an entire new scene will open itself, and we have the world to begin again. And this new scene is indeed epitomized by the new freedoms won by Jews in the post-revolutionary era. Isaac has already described them, the letter of George Washington, the impact of the Bill of Rights, and the new freedoms that we know Jews won in state after state, and the promise by the President of the United States that in America, the religious liberty would be an inherent natural right, and Jews could expect and hope that to bigotry there would be no sanction, and to persecution no assistance. Back to you, Isaac.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ladies and gentlemen, as you see on the screen, and I believe there should be a link in the chat, Jewish Heritage Alliance is making Dr. Sarna's book, American Judaism, A History, in its updated and revised edition, published by Yale University Press, available for purchase. The link's just been pasted. It's a captivating overview of the 3.5 centuries of the American Jewish experience, the winner of the 2004 National Jewish Book Award. I have my own copy, and I highly recommend it to everyone. So thank you again, Jonathan. It's my pleasure to now introduce our next speaker, Professor Paul Finkelman, a specialist in American legal history, constitutional law, American Jewish history, and race in the law, a remarkably prolific writer. He is the author of more than 200 scholarly articles and the editor or author of over 50 books. He also serves as the Chancellor and Distinguished Professor of History at Gratz College in Greater Philadelphia. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Isaac, and it's a delight to be here. I will be turning to some slides in a few minutes, but initially I will not be using slides. I will be talking to you about the role of Jews in the American Revolution. And the revolution for Jews cuts in 2 directions. The most common discussion is how the revolution changed Jewish life. And Jonathan Sarna, who it was delightful to listen to, exemplified this in his classic essay, The Impact of the American Revolution on American Jews. I want to kind of turn this around today and talk about the impact of Jews on the American Revolution. My argument is that the presence of Jews and the behavior of Jews in the revolutionary era changes the United States, changes America, fundamentally or alters the way the United States develops. 1765 is more or less the beginning of the era of the American Revolution. And it takes 10 years for the revolution to develop and begin at Lexington and Concord. In that era, at the beginning of that era, every nation in Europe has an official religion, what we call an established church. In Britain, it is the Anglican Church, which is also known as the Church of England. You can't get more British than that. In Holland, it is the Dutch Reformed Church. In Russia, it is the Russian Orthodox Church. In most of Southern Europe and in France, it is, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. This was also the same in most of the colonies, with exceptions of Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and to some extent New York. There were official churches in all of the British colonies, not only on the mainland, but also in the Caribbean. Virginia, the largest British colony, had an established Anglican church, and taxpayers paid money to support that church, whether they were Anglicans or not. The same was true in the British colonies in the Caribbean. Throughout the British colonies, Jews were tolerated. They were allowed to settle. They were initially allowed to practice their faith quietly. They were allowed to build synagogues, but they weren't, in most places, part of the political structure. They were not allowed to vote in the Caribbean. They could not practice law in the Caribbean. Indeed, in the 1780s, a son of a very important Jewish family in England moved to Jamaica and was told he could not practice law. But in the 13 colonies that become the United States, things are different. Jews are active in politics. They are active in protesting British policy. So that in 1765, there is a non-importation agreement signed by Jewish businessmen in a number of the cities that Jonathan was talking about: Savannah, New York, Philadelphia, and Newport. And in those cities, the Jews join with their Christian neighbors in signing non-importation agreements. In Philadelphia, there is Mordecai, there is Moses Mordecai, there are 3 men with the last name Levy, there is Bernard Gratz, there is Michael Gratz. I should say that the Gratz family, of course, would eventually endow the college that I teach at, Gratz College. There is Mattathias Bush, Joseph Jacobs. All of them are connected to Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. In 1769, there is another agreement signed, and this time Mattathias Bush actually adds his Hebrew initials to his English signature. Same thing happens in Rhode Island. The businessman Isaac Mendes Satius, who of course is related to he is the son of Gershom Mendes Satius, who will be the spiritual leader of Shearith Israel in New York. He signs a non-importation agreement. In response to the Stamp Act, 10 Jews in New York signed protests, including Hyman Levy, Jonas Phillips, Samson Simpson. Some Jews joined the Sons of Liberty, the proto-revolutionary organization, like Chaim Solomon. We most remember Chaim Solomon as a financial person helping to keep the new country going by procuring loans and helping balance the budget. But Chaim Solomon begins as a revolutionary soldier in the Sons of Liberty, and he's jailed for this in New York. He escapes from jail and goes to Philadelphia. Towards the end of the revolution, the government leaves Philadelphia and moves to a couple of other cities, and a number of Jewish businessmen join their Philadelphia Christian neighbors in signing a petition asking the Congress to return to Philadelphia, including Jonas Phillips, Moses Cohen, Isaac Moses, Chaim Solomon, now a Philadelphian, Sal Marachi, Isaac Franks, Seymour Hart, Isaac Levy, Jacob Simpson. During the Revolution, Jews serve as officers in the American Army. Now, this shouldn't come as a big surprise to us, except for the fact that there are no Jewish officers in the French Army, the British Army, the Dutch Army, and of course not in the Spanish or Portuguese armies. So in that sense, what is happening in America is very, very different. In the 1730s, Jews in New York are elected 7 times to public offices. They are minor officers, they aren't major offices, but Jews are running for office, Jews are voting. Given the small number of Jews in the city, this suggests both the lack of at least political anti-Semitism, that is, they're social anti-Semites, but they vote for Jew, and the fact that Jews are, in a sense, inserting themselves into the political process, into the development of a nation in a way that would have been unheard of in Europe. As we know, Mordecai Sheftal is a leader of the Congregation Mikveh Israel in Savannah. He is also a leader of the revolution. He also reaches the rank during the revolution of full colonel. Now, we have to understand, for most of the revolution, there are a couple of major generals like Washington, who ultimately becomes a lieutenant general. But for most of the revolution, he's a major general. There are brigadier generals, and below the rank of brigadier general is full colonel. So we have a Jewish full colonel, 3rd highest ranking officer in the American Army. He couldn't have been an officer in any of the other armies. He serves as the deputy commissary general for federal troops, and then he is captured and imprisoned. Before the war begins, we have Francis Salvador elected out of Charleston, South Carolina. There is, of course, a synagogue, Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim in Charleston. Francis Salvador is elected to the provisional South Carolina legislature. He is reelected in 1776 after the revolution begins, and then he dies in battle. He is probably the first Jew to die in the American Revolution. During the revolution, Lieutenant Colonel David Franks serves on a number of staffs of generals. Isaac Franks is an officer. Major Solomon Bush, the son of Mattathias Bush, who, remember, put his Hebrew initials on one of these petitions, serves as the adjutant general for Pennsylvania. His brother, Lewis Bush, dies at the Battle of Brandywine. Eventually, Major Bush will become a lieutenant colonel. The New Yorker, Abraham Mendes Satius, one of the leading Sephardi families in America, is also an officer in the Continental Army. And as Jonathan just pointed out, Aaron Lopez, one of the leaders of the Jews in Newport, leaves Newport, runs away, along with members of the Rivera family, the Mendez family, nearly 70 people resettling in Leicester, Massachusetts, because they are patriots. So the patriot Jews are incredibly important in changing the nature of the political culture of America. It is worth noting there are some Tory Jews. There are some Jews who go back to England. There are some Jews who die fighting for the British. But what is significant in looking at the American Revolution is that nobody points to the Tory Jews and say, oh, see those Jews, they're not patriots. On the contrary, people are voting for Jews, people are supporting Jews, and Jews are serving in the army. So that's the first piece of what I want to talk about. It is worth noting that after the revolution, we will create West Point, the American Army Military Academy. Half of the first graduating class of West Point was Jewish. Now, I have to say, this is kind of a trick comment because there are only 2 students, but one of them is Simon Levy. Jews can't go to the officer academies in France or in England at this time. It will not be to the late 1820s that a Jew could be an officer in the British Army. This is the change that is taking place, and it's changing because American Jews are, in a sense, leading the American Revolution to be different in the way it treats Jews. I now want to turn to a slightly different subject. In 1781, the Congress authorizes the printing of this book, The Constitutions of the Several Independent States of America. And in this book, you have all of the constitutions that then exist in the various states. There are, by this time, 11 state constitutions. Rhode Island, Connecticut don't have them. This book is reprinted a number of times. This is the cover page of the original, which was published in Philadelphia. That's 1781. In 1783, Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia buys a copy of this book, and someone at Mikveh Israel goes through it. This is the sort of copyright page, goes through it, and as you can see at the very bottom, this begins to write about what's in this book. And so here he says, by this constitution, Jews can hold office. I'm sorry, cannot hold office. This is the Constitution of Maryland. So Jews can't hold office in Maryland. They can't hold office in North Carolina. But in New Jersey, this long commentary sort of says, well, it looks like maybe they can hold office in New Jersey. So this is the work of Mikveh Israel. I would argue that Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, in some ways, is the precursor of the Anti-Defamation League. It is the first Jewish civil rights organization. It is an organization that is designed to help Jews become full citizens. And so when the Constitutional Convention meets in 1787, Jonas Phillips of Congregation Mikveh Israel writes a letter to George Washington in September of 1787, asking that there be full religious freedom in this new constitution that is being written. Now, what Jonas Phillips doesn't know is that the Constitutional Convention has already put in a clause in the Constitution which says that there can be no religious test for office holding. This is unique. This is the first time in the history, as far as I can tell, of the world where a country says, we will not ask you what your faith is. We will not require you to take an oath on a particular Bible. We will not require you to take an oath to Jesus Christ or the Church of England or the Dutch Reformed Church. That's not going to happen in the United States. And so again, Mikveh Israel and the Jewish community are pushing for this. And this is what happens. In many ways, this is the most important clause of the US Constitution, because it sets the United States apart from all other nations in declaring that at the national level, there can be no religious test for office holding. And by the 1830s, most states had abandoned their state discriminations on Jews holding office, although North Carolina manages to hold out till after the Civil War, and Maryland doesn't do it until the 1820s. Oddly, in Maryland, there is a bill passed called the Jew Bill. And the first time you encounter the term Jew Bill, you think this must be some sort of anti-Semitic law, but it's not. It's just the opposite. It's a law that says Jews can now hold public office. And then we get, of course, to Washington's famous letter to synagogues, including the Touro Synagogue. And as we know, it ends with his famous statement that in the United States, bigotry will have no sanction. I want to say something about this letter in a slightly different context. Rhode Island is the last state to ratify the Constitution. And what George Washington is telling the Rhode Islanders is, the Jewish community, you should be glad you're in this country. You should be glad you ratified, because there's freedom of religion, and to bigotry, there's no sanction. And with that, I would like to turn it back to Isaac.
Thank you, Paul. Our next presenter is Mr. Keith Stokes, who will be speaking on the Touro Synagogue and Community in Newport, Rhode Island. Among his many positions, he has served as Rhode Island advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, vice president and trustee of the Preservation Society for Newport County, a member of the advisory board of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, a board member of the Newport Historical Society, and chairman of the Touro Synagogue Foundation. Keith, you have the floor.
Thank you, Isaac, and it's wonderful to be here and share about 350 years of Jewish Newport history in about 10 minutes. My particular presentation is entitled Faith, Freedom, and Family, and it'll be an interpretation of the early Jewish experience in Newport, Rhode Island, based upon the faith of the earliest settlers, the freedom that was fought for and achieved by the 18th century, and then to give an examples of two of the most prominent early Jewish families, the Hayes and Turrell family. I think in the discussion of faith, we recognize that the early Jews that arrived through the Jewish diaspora, starting with the Edict of Expulsion from 1492, in the Newport story, we now know that many of the earliest Jews to arrive in the mid-18th century started from what is today Curacao to Barbados and then eventually to Newport. The earliest Jews that would arrive, we believed, arrived somewhere within 1658. That is 5 years before Rhode Island's own charter of organization is established 5 years later. The first Jews to arrive, Mordecai Conable, Moses Pacheco, that led that effort. At the time that they arrived largely via Barbados because Newport, along with Charleston, South Carolina, had active trading partnerships during the mid-17th century with Barbados. So Barbados would have been a known trading entity to Newport merchants, and Newport merchants would have recognized Barbados. So for the most of us, we believe that these early Jews would arrive by 1658 because there was a general knowledge that Newport, along with New Amsterdam, today New York, and Charleston, South Carolina, were active training centers. At the time when these Jews arrived, they'd arrive within 5 years when a new English charter would be established, a charter that would espouse religious freedom for those Protestant Christian members of society. And in fact, the earliest Jews that arrived, their most significant leave behind, which exists to this very day, is a burial ground, which is established in 1677. The original deed of trust still exists within the archives of the city of Newport. And that burying ground, which is set aside today at the very entrance of Newport's historical Bellevue Avenue. There are over 15 burials and another 20 unearthed burials within this very sacred Hebrew burying ground. And as this first group of Jews would arrive, what they found was not religious freedom. Religious freedom was set aside for Protestant Christian majority, but religious toleration. And in fact, by 1684, soon after establishing a burying ground, those early Jews would petition the Rhode Island General Assembly at Newport, asking very simply, could we remain as non-Protestant Christians? And in a response that exists today in our archives, the Rhode Island General Assembly would say that they, the Jews, may expect a good protection here as a stranger, being not of our nation, residing among His Majesty's colony, as long as they're obedient to His Majesty's laws. So the early Jews arrived did not receive religious freedom, but religious toleration. They were being tolerated as strangers, not as full citizens of the colony of Rhode Island in the town of Newport. And now we want to talk a little bit about the freedom, because by the 18th century, Newport becomes the fourth largest trading port in British North America. So merchant class are coming from all over the world and all over the new fledgling country to establish trade activity within Newport. And we also see between 1705 and 1775, that 75-year period, which we call Newport's golden age of maritime trade, we see a significant growth of the Jewish community. In fact, the image that you see, which is an 1805 painting representation of what is today our town center in Newport, or today Washington Square, a number of the homes and businesses that still exist were Jewish households and Jewish places of business. So during that golden age, we see a significant growth in Jewish presence in Newport. In fact, it's this religious toleration which begins to open the door for religious entrepreneurship and also Jewish merchant entrepreneurship. We begin to see Jews arriving directly from Spain, Portugal, England, Germany. Many are coming from New York and Shearith Israel, from Philadelphia, from Mikveh Israel, and they're arriving in Newport mostly as entrepreneurs. These Jewish entrepreneurs are now involved in a very interdependent life and work, not integrated, interdependent life and work with the larger Christian trade community. In fact, we see some of the earliest Jews introducing Castile soap, spermaceti candle making, rum, and other trade activities. Newport by the mid-18th century is not only the fourth largest trading port in British North America, it is the largest slave trading port. And what's important to recognize is that as the Jews are starting to arrive and establish themselves in merchant trades, they're also looking to eventually begin to build a permanency in their religious belief system. And one of the more extraordinary circumstances that we see in Newport during the 18th century, that this interdependent living between Christians and Jews would also spill over in a level of interconnectedness of several of the leading Christian Protestant religious leaders actively interacting with Jewish religious leaders and fellow Jewish merchants. In fact, Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who will later become the first true abolitionist in early America, is actively engaging with the young and newly arrived Hazan or Reverend Isaac Turrell. Rabbi Isaac Carrigal, that's traveling all across the new Jewish settlements in the Western Hemisphere, also spends time in Newport. And while in Newport, he's personally interacting with Reverend, again, Hopkins and also Ezra Stiles of the Second Congregational Church. And in fact, it is Hopkins and Stiles that say in their own diaries and memoirs, they are influenced by Carrigal and Turrell as they begin to understand their interpretation of the Christian Bible and the Old Testament. We also see that Ezra Stiles particularly writes extensively in his diary his Christian interpretation of the Jewish life in the Jewish community and certain Jewish citizens in early Newport. And as you can see from these statements, Ezra Stiles is clearly connected to and clearly independent with these Jewish arrivals and understanding and interpreting his own Protestant Christian Old Testament understanding by comparing it to Jewish scholars and Jewish religious leaders. So Newport during this mid-18th century period, the years leading up to the American Revolution, you have this extraordinary circumstance where Jews and Christians are living, working, and worshiping interdependently, all in close proximity in a very small and a very densely populated urban seaport. And one of the things that we recognize today in Newport, with a population of just less than 25,000 people, has close to 350 existing original colonial structures and landscapes, more than any city in America. That includes many structures and landscapes that reflect early Jews living, working, and worshiping in colonial America. And it's this religious toleration and freedom friction that begins to take rise in the years leading up to the American Revolution. As said by Dr. Sonner and others, Aaron Lopez at that time was not only the most influential maritime merchant in Newport, but possibly one of the most influential in America at that time. Aaron Lopez, along with his father-in-law and his uncle, Jacob Ruiz Rivera, had financial investments in nearly 100 shipping vessels. They had a hand in nearly every aspect of Newport and larger British North American trade. Twice, in 1762 and again in 1764, Aaron Lopez, and then joined by Isaac Elizer, another Jewish merchant in Newport, would petition the Rhode Island General Assembly, which referred to the Rhode Island Attorney General, for full naturalized citizenship. Both times they were denied from the basic premise that the original charter of 1663 had provided full citizenship and naturalizations to only those who profess the Christian religion. So one of the great and most extraordinary ironies of the years leading up to the American Revolution, certainly in Newport, is that several of the most leading citizens, taxpayers, employers, and contributors to the Newport and even the American economy, Jewish merchants like Aaron Lopez and Isaac Elizer, were simply denied the rights of full citizenship, simply of not being of a majority Protestant Christian religion. So as we move towards American Revolution and the calls for action based upon taxation without representation, how did the Jewish leadership feel about the issue of taxation without representation in the country that many of them had been born to, had contributed to, and were ready and willing to fight and die for? And it would be this issue that would begin to drive the early Jewish communities across the Americas by the end of the American Revolution, as they began to interact with the newly established President George Washington. And as Washington and his entourage would arrive in Newport by August of 1790, the warden of the Hebrew congregation, Jeshuat Israel, would present a letter similar to letters that were being created and designed and presented by other congregations at that time, and stating the very specific request that we as citizens, we as contributing members of the early America, and of our now new state of Rhode Island have every right to receive the benefits of citizenship, regardless of religious tests. This famous letter and this famous request would later be embodied into the United States Constitution. So let me close with family, because I think it's always important for us to recognize the very people and the nature of the people who were the early settlers, contributors, and builders and holders and maintainers of Jewish history and heritage and religion. And in Newport's case, we're going to give a quick review of two very prominent families, the families of Turrell and Hayes. Isaac Turrell would arrive by 1760 via Amsterdam, a very young man of age of 20, and he was brought to Newport by the Jewish men leaders who were looking for a very young spiritual leader, religious leader, who would help lead the effort along with the leading men to design and build a permanent place of worship. And it would be Reverend Isaac Turrell that would lead the effort of designing and eventually completing for Hanukkah on December 2nd, 1763, the temple that bears the name of the family to this very day. His wife, Raina Turrell, was sister to Moses Michael Hayes. Moses Michael Hayes, again, arriving from Amsterdam through his father Judah to New York. Both families actively engaged with Shearith Israel in New York, would later relocate to Newport. It is the Hayes and Turrell families that produce offspring that later becomes some of the most significant contributors to early Jewish and American philanthropy, but also helping to establish further Jewish presence in Boston, Massachusetts, Richmond, Virginia, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Moses Michael Hayes would establish himself in Boston, and by the 1790s in the North End, he's one of the single Jewish families at that time, but he's quickly involved in establishing both business and benevolent and civic activities. In fact, it is Moses Michael Hayes that helps establish and he becomes Grand Master of the Massachusetts Masonic Lodge. He also sends each of his sons to the Latin school, and he's also fully engaged in supporting the revolutionary efforts in Boston during and post-American Revolution. Moses Michael Hayes, at the time of his life, is seen as one of the most prominent citizens now of Boston. By 1784, as Dr. Sonner had stated, the Turrell family, who had left Newport and arrived to Kingston, Jamaica, by 1783, Isaac Turrell dies, and his widow, Raina Turrell Hayes, and young children, which include Rebecca, Abraham, and Judah, join her brother in Boston and become a large blended Jewish family of Hayes and Turrell living in late 18th century and early 19th century Boston. And one of the most important records of that life of the early Jewish family of Hayes and Turrell in Boston comes from a Reverend Samuel May. Samuel May is probably more known today as uncle to the famous author of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott. But during the time of Samuel May, he would become one of the leading founding Unitarian Christian ministers of America, one of the earliest, most active abolitionists, but most importantly, a lifelong friend of the Turrells and Hayes family well into the mid-19th century. And it's fact, in the life and times of Samuel May, in his own memoirs, he talks about what life was like growing up from a Christian perspective as a child, growing up and living within the Hayes household and observing Jewish religious rituals and activities, again, from a Christian perspective. But what's most important, as similar to Reverend Stiles and Reverend Hopkins of Colonial Newport, it is Reverend Samuel May that begins to interpret and understand and help perfect his own Christian religion by interacting with early Jewish families and understanding and interpreting their religion. And Abraham Turrell, the second youngest son of Isaac Turrell and Raina Hayes Turrell, himself moves to Medford, Massachusetts, and becomes a significant and prosperous merchant, trading with his brother in New Orleans, with other Jewish merchants in Savannah, Charleston, and in New York. At the time of his death, in his will, he gives significant money to the legislature of Rhode Island, $10,000, specifically to support the Jewish synagogue in Rhode Island at Newport, and to set up a special trust to maintain a rabbi in Jewish services in religion and support. That trust is the oldest existing trust that still exists and bears interest today in Rhode Island and supports the rabbi in the congregation at Newport. Abraham Turrell would also leave money behind to build a stone wall and enclosure around the Hebrew cemetery. He would also leave money behind to build a stone wall and fencing around the synagogue and grounds. By 1824, his sister, Rebecca Turrell Lopez, who marries into the Lopez family, is relocated to New York, but she still cares deeply about her family and her early Jewish heritage in Newport. And at the time of her will, she also negotiates with the Rhode Island General Assembly to maintain the presence of a $10,000 endowment for the synagogue. She also oversees that the money be set aside to continue to restore the unoccupied now synagogue and grounds. In fact, today, the work of Rebecca Turrell Lopez is recognized as one of the earliest Jewish women in America's history that's actively engaged in historic preservation and philanthropy. And possibly the most famous Turrell child, Judah Turrell, which most people today recognize his will of over $500,000, would bequeath to institutions both Jewish and religious across the country and the world at that time, which would set the stage for Jewish philanthropy that's recognized to this very day. In fact, today, Judah Turrell is recognized as possibly one of America's first philanthropists and most significant philanthropists. And what's most important about recognizing Judah Turrell is the fact that his influence still exists today in maintaining dozens of Jewish religious, educational, and hospital institutions. Two of the youngest Hayes children, cousins of Abraham and Judah Turrell, Rebecca Turrell Lopez, is Sloey Hayes and Catherine Hayes. Sloey Hayes, today we have a series of letters between her and her friend, her dear friend, Rebecca Gratz in Philadelphia. And these letters give us an incredibly important insight in the life of Jewish women. As Jewish men are building business, fighting wars, and building wealth, it is Jewish women who are maintaining Jewish households, raising Jewish children, setting up schools, and most importantly, maintaining that Jewish link within communities that were under significant pressure by the outside majority religious and population groups. And in fact, it is the letters between Sloey Hayes and Rebecca Gratz that give us a series of interchange of early life, early Jewish life in America from the perspective of Jewish women. And possibly one of the most interesting excerpts of the letter written on July 7th, 1812, during the beginning of the War of 1812, we have Sloey Hayes suggesting to Rebecca Gratz that were the world composed of women, we should have no weapons. And she later writes a letter to Reverend Samuel May, reminding him that the Christian community should treat kindly and fairly, as she is actually sewing, creating a high collar for the Reverend, and reminding him that I will sew this collar quite high and prick your chin so that you would not ought to be unkind to our dear people. And what's most important and recognized today in Newport is that that ancient Hebrew burying ground, established well back in 1677, today has the remains of nearly all of the early Sephardic families that once lived, worked, and worshiped in early Newport in America, particularly those of Hayes and those of Turrell. Thank you for allowing 10 to 12 minutes to share this history, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Our final speaker is Mr. Eli Gabay, Esquire, President or Parnas of Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, established in 1740 and known as the Synagogue of the American Revolution. An attorney and prosecutor in the historic trial of John Demjanjuk in the state of Israel. He also sits on the board of Mikveh Israel's Revolutionary Period Cemetery and is a board member of the American Sephardi Federation. Eli, I turn it over to you.
Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much for joining this great web seminar. My name is Eli Gabay. I'm the Parnas and president of Congregation Mikveh Israel, established in 1740, where I'm located right now, and indeed located not more than a half a block from the Liberty Bell and from the Constitution Center and from all the other institutions and icons of America, of the cradle of American democracy, and not more than a half a block from where our original building was built in 1771. So this is right here from Independence Mall, where the Liberty Bell states and proclaim liberty in the country. I would indicate to you that the Liberty Bell was brought by Nathan Levy, an early Jewish Philadelphian who was member of this congregation, and he was given a plot of a cemetery, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that was given to him by Thomas Penn, the son of William Penn, who of course established Pennsylvania. Now, Congregation Mikveh Israel boasts itself, we are the longest running congregation since some of the other congregations had fled from the British and had come to Philadelphia and to join us. But this is really where it happened. Indeed, Benjamin Franklin had donated money, and we have the actual receipt in our archives to the establishment of our first building in 1771. So we have a receipt from him, and he is our neighbor, so to say, as he is buried not more than a half a block away from us. You are invited to come to us. You are invited to join us when you come to Philadelphia or plan to come to Philadelphia. You could see the Liberty Bell, as well as visit the other bell, which is located at Christ Church, which is the other institution that was in Philadelphia at the beginning of Philadelphia. Now, I wanted to highlight some individuals. What you have before you is the picture of one of the greatest Jews of that era, a vice president and Sagan of Congregation Mikveh Israel. Haim Solomon is known as the financier of the American Revolution and is known and should be known as an American patriot. He, true to his name, was a wise man, as Solomon was, and a visionary. He was loyal and devoted to George Washington, to the Continental Army, its finance, and making sure that the troops had food, had clothing, had weapons. All of these required monies, which he raised. He was a Jewish businessman, and as I said, who belonged to Congregation Mikveh Israel, spoke 8 languages, and was just an incredible man. Indeed, it is understood that he probably raised, by today's standards, something along the lines of $9.4 billion. Yet he died penniless. You should know that, sympathizing with the patriot cause, he fought, as our professor had indicated earlier, with the colonial army. And I should tell you that he was caught by the British twice. The first time he was caught in prison for 18 months, and the second time he was arrested again in 1778, tried as a spy against the British, and convicted of espionage and sentenced to death. He also contracted tuberculosis while 3 years in the British jail. He escaped and made it back to Philadelphia. And as I said, he died penniless because his contributions were not paid in time. He left 3 children and a wife who was pregnant, and he's indeed a true patriot. This is the burial spot of where he is buried. He is buried in our cemetery, which is located 8th and Spruce in Philadelphia. And as I said, that cemetery was given to us by William Penn's son. Now, Congress in 1956 declared the cemetery a national shrine. And in that cemetery, you have indeed some of the other pioneers and patriots who are buried, amongst them Manuel Josephson. Now, I just want to finish with who was a former Parnas, or president of Congregation Mikveh Israel, and who presented the letter to George Washington the letter from the four congregations, the Hebrew congregations. Now, you know, this is some 232 years later, but after the giving of the original letter, Congregation Turo in Rhode Island jumped the gun, so to say. It was agreed that all of the congregations would give a letter altogether, but they did jump the gun. We don't fault them 232 years later, but we point out that there was another letter that was presented to George Washington by the Hebrew congregations of Philadelphia, written, as I said, the letter by Manuel Josephson, whose picture you see here, by New York, by Charleston, and by Richmond. And that letter was responded to by George Washington in the same way that he had responded to the Rhode Island letter, which basically stated that that bigotry and would not be tolerated in these United States, and he gave a license for Jews, of course, to continue and to practice their religion freely. In finishing up back about Haim Solomon, I just want to point out that Haim Solomon was so important that there was in 1975 United States Postal Service a stamp that was commemorated honoring him, and on that it says financial hero, businessman, and broker Haim Solomon responsible for raising most of the money needed to finance the American Revolution and later to save the new nation from collapse. So think about it, the contribution of the Jews. And I just want to say this, it wasn't so easy for the Jews to decide, perhaps, that they would join the revolutionary period, because Jews had a lot of benefits and were free in some respect to a great extent during the British times, and yet they stood from the very beginning, from the very inception of this great country. I will finish with Haim Solomon and indicate that there was a ship that was commissioned in 1943 during World War II, named in naming of Haim Solomon. He was a model to inspire Jewish respect and loyalty, and his efforts are proof that Jews belonged in America and were devoted from the very, very start. I'm a little challenged in terms of time, but let me just say that I'm holding in my hand a copy of the actual letter that was sent back from George Washington to us, and this is the letter that really established the tone of the times, that Jews were free to practice in this country. This you see over here is the second building of Congregation Mikveh Israel. You can see the colonial type of building. The building collapsed, but we are still here. And some of the artifacts of Congregation Mikveh Israel are behind me from various periods of our existence of 283 some years. And that's, as you can see, behind me. One of the last individuals I will touch on is Uriah Levy, who was a Commodore, which was the highest rank that you could achieve in the US Navy. And he was member of the Congregation of Mikveh Israel, having been born in 1792 and passed away in 1862. And he was a naval officer. A ship was commissioned after his name also during World War II in 1942. This is the congregation, ladies and gentlemen, that bears the legacy of those who fled the Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition. And amongst them were great men and great women. And I highlight to you Rebecca Gratz. Rebecca Gratz is just one of the great ladies, many who have served on the boards of this congregation, on the boards of this congregation. And she was an American Jewish educator, a philanthropist. She was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And she established such organizations that that were necessary in the beginning of this country, such as the Philadelphia Orphan Asylum, the Female Hebrew Benevolent Society of 1819, and the Hebrew Schools of America were established by Rebecca Gratz. You can read more about her. I would like to finish with the concept that religious freedom was given to Jews in this country, and that basically it started here in Philadelphia and in Rhode Island and the other congregations, and it is our duty to continue to keep the religious freedom in this country in a pluralistic manner, and to continue the message that was sent by George Washington and that was followed by the leaders of this congregation throughout from 1740 and until today, of religious tolerance, of religious freedom, and of pride from our very beginning and until today. Thank you very much. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you for your insightful and informative presentation, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes at the Q&A session. Before we get into the Q&A segment, I'd like to get everyone's attention as I make our necessary and important appeal for your assistance and support. Jewish Heritage Alliance delivers informative, engaging events year-round. In the process, we have been fortunate to develop an avid and significant following. We offer these events for free and ask you to donate if you so choose. Some of you were kind enough to rise to the occasion and make donations. The fact is that we depend on your support and contributions to sustain these captivating educational programs. We ask you to make a difference, and please participate in these programs by donating today. Please see our donation page is appearing on the Q&A section. Please take a moment to donate now, or copy the link or go to our website and donate after the program. Thank you. We now open the program to questions and answers and related panel discussions. Take it away, Isaac.
Thank you, Michael. To all the presenters, thank you very much. We've had, of course, as you can probably imagine, quite a number of questions. I think I'd like to start, and again, everyone, please feel free to chime in. First, to focus just on 1654 and perhaps the beginnings, and then there's a number of questions on the American Revolution that we'll get to. So the first question to Jonathan is, what was the relationship in the early colonial years between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, I guess after 1654? And then to that, when did that year of 1654 become fixed in our collective memory or history as the birth of American Jewish history?
Both excellent questions. What is so fascinating about colonial America is that, unlike, say, in London or in Holland or many other places, every single one of the colonial synagogues had both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. In the case of Shearith Israel, you can almost see when a Parnas would be of Sephardic extraction and a Gomez, and the next Parnas would be a Franks, a well-known Ashkenazi. As Eli Gabai pointed out with his reference to the Gratzes. The Gratzes, as their name implies, come from Gratz. They're Ashkenazi Jews, but the congregation is Sephardi. And Mikveh Israel always has had both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. If you go to Newport and you carefully, as my friend Keith knows, you carefully look at those chandeliers. One is given by an Ashkenazi Jew, one by a Sephardi Jew, as if to say both are welcome in Jeshuat Israel. And of course, it was a very small community, and many Sfaradim married Ashkenazim. That's even true in the Seixas family. Now, 1654 is already understood in the 19th century when people begin to study the records as being very important for the very reason that Isaac mentioned. This is the beginning of Jewish group settlement, meaning not people who were secret Jews or whom we can wonder, are they maybe of Jewish ancestry. These are public Jews sailing into New Amsterdam, having been expelled as Jews from Brazil, and they petition for the right to not only stay, live, and remain, but also to trade. And they're backed up by fellow Jews in Amsterdam. And so this is the beginning of Jewish group settlement, although we certainly know that there were earlier crypto Jews going all the way back to the 16th century, but we ascribe Jewishness to them. We have no evidence that they observed, nor was it a Jewish community. And community then and now is central to Jewish continuity.
Thank you for that. So let's move on to the period of the American Revolution. A number of questions have been raised, of course, with effectively contrasting the progressive, far-sighted nature of the founders in terms of religious liberty and their involvement in slavery or the slave trade. And so on one hand, or I guess, how would you, and of course, this could be to Paul, to Keith or Ellie, everyone, how would you assess the views of some of the founders in terms of this potential hypocrisy, especially in Washington's letter? So the question says, where he pledges to give bigotry no sanction. At the same time, the original Constitution seems to protect slavery and only counts African Americans as 3/5 of all other persons.
Let me take a shot at that in a couple of ways. First, the Constitution does not count African Americans as 3/5 of persons. It counts slaves as 3/5 of a person for allocating representation in Congress. And this is an important thing because, of course, by the time the Constitution is written, slavery has been abolished in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. It is dying in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. And free blacks will be counted just as free whites for purposes of representation in Congress. Nevertheless, the Constitution protects slavery in a variety of ways, including the Fugitive Slave Clause, protects the African slave trade for at least 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. What's hard for people today to understand is that slavery is absolutely ubiquitous in the Atlantic world. Every one of the colonizing countries, and that includes England, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, Sweden, all of these countries have slaves in their colonies. All of them are involved in one way or another in the slave trade. And that is part of the world they are in. So that it would be unusual to expect that any group of people in America would not have been involved in slavery. There were Quaker slave owners, even though we remember Quakers as opposing slavery, which many of them do. So when we look at the Jewish community, the same thing. There are Jewish slave owners. There are also Jews who joined the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. There are Jews who joined the New York Manumission Society to end slavery in New York. And some of these Jews are very active in trying to convince other Jews they should give up slave owning. But slave owning is deeply embedded in the Atlantic world, and it is deeply embedded in American culture. Before of the first American presidents, only the two Adamses don't own slaves up until you get to the 1850s, when you have Franklin Pierce and then Abraham Lincoln, who don't own slaves. By the way, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania owned a slave as a young man. Martin Van Buren of New York owned slaves as a young man. Slavery is so deeply embedded into our culture that it is virtually impossible to find people. One more thing, and then I'll be quiet for a minute. Benjamin Franklin is the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. Throughout most of his life, he owned slaves. It's only late in life that he says, I shouldn't do this. John Jay is president of the New York Manumission Society. He signs the law as governor of New York to begin the end of slavery in New York. He also owns slaves. It's a very complicated, confusing world. One of the questions that comes up is, were Jews slave traders? And the answer is, except for Lopez in Newport and one of his partners, there are very, very few Jews who are involved in the importation of slaves from Africa or moving slaves from one part of the United States to another. There's a very good book on Jews in the slave trade, which points out that throughout the British world, Jews are less likely to be slave traders than other men of their same economic and business classes. That doesn't say that there weren't Jewish slave traders, because there were. It's simply that to blame slavery on the Jews, as among other things Minister Farrakhan does, is simply historical nonsense.
Thank you. Keith, regarding Newport, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think Paul did an excellent job summarizing the historical facts. I mean, it's fascinating to me, being chair of the Education Committee at the Charles Synagogue Foundation, but also being a direct descendant of the earliest Sephardic Jews to arrive in Newport, and also the earliest enslaved African heritage people who would arrive in Philadelphia and Newport. I think what's important to understand is that the transatlantic slave trade and the ensuing slave ownership was an equal opportunity employer that included nearly every race, ethnicity, and religion and nation of origin, including the African continent. And one of the most important aspects of understanding this in Newport is that, as I had said in my presentation, between 1705 and 1805, during that golden age of maritime trade, Newport was, for all intents and purposes, the largest slave trading port in British North America. I mean, Newport merchants during that 100-year period, we have at least 935 documented slave voyages. And what's important to recognize is that those Jewish merchants who participated in that trade had nothing to do with their Jewish religion. It had everything to do with the fact that they were 18th century merchants, as was the Quaker merchants, Anglican merchants, Baptist merchants. In fact, we now know through primary and secondary documentation, a significant number of the crew on slave vessels included African heritage men. So what's important to recognize is that in the very beginnings of the settlement and the establishment of the Western Hemisphere are based on two basic premises: indigenous people land and enslaved African people labor. That builds the prosperity, the wealth, and much of the history that we today recognize tied to those institutions. So as we have a better understanding of the slave institution and how nearly all men participated, it's important that we have a better understanding of history. Here in Newport, because of the Aaron Lopez records, which are largely intact, people have mistakenly assigned his records in his participation in the trade over other Jewish merchants or all Jewish citizens of that time. And that's just a false narrative. What's important to also recognize is that these Africans that would arrive to particularly colonial Newport Seaport, many of them were trained as tradesmen. And what's most unique is many of them are living, working, and even worshiping in the same household as masters and mistress. Those enslaved Africans and later free Africans in Jewish households take on Jewish names and identities. In fact, today in Newport, we have the oldest intact African enslaved and free African burying ground dating back to 1705. There's an entire section of that burying ground that includes African enslaved and free that are in Jewish households that take on the names of Rebecca and Moses and many other names. So this is a history that needs further exploration, further understanding, and most importantly, further validation and documentation.
Let me say this kindly. In our 282 years of record keeping, I would tell you the Congregation Mikveh Israel prides itself on many members from that time and up to today of African heritage. And this congregation has stood for that.
Well, thank you. This is most fascinating. Regarding now going to the Constitution, so Paul, we could perhaps start with you, but it goes, I guess, to Mikveh Israel. So Jonas Phillips wrote the petition to the Constitutional Convention, not knowing that the delegates had already prohibited the religious tests prior to the petition. Did his petition, or perhaps his work in the revolution, along with Haim Solomon, did that impact the drafting of the First Amendment, guaranteeing free exercise to all?
Probably not. And I know it would be nice if we could say, oh, yeah, of course. But the reality is that when the Constitution is sent for ratification, and it is ultimately ratified by every state, opponents of the Constitution, and in some places they're quite powerful, are fearful that the national government will create a national religion, just as states had national religions. They are fearful that there they're very fearful of everything. They're fearful of tyranny. They think Washington's going to become Julius Caesar. They think the Senate is going to take over the United States. And there are lots of things they worry about, but almost all of them say we need a protection for religious freedom. And what's fascinating is that most of these people live in states where there is no separation of church and state. And so in Maryland or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, Jews are not allowed to be elected to public office. But they say at the national level, we have to have this. The main drafter of the First Amendment is James Madison. He had been a force to be reckoned with in Virginia, ending Virginia's established church. He is the man who puts the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom through the Virginia legislature. Thomas Jefferson drafted it and then went to France. Madison revises it a little, and Madison's the politician that gets it through. So Madison doesn't need any help from the Jews to know that he has to do this. On the other hand, Madison is in Philadelphia during the Revolution, after the Revolution, during the Constitutional Convention. He knows Haim Solomon. He knows other Jews in the community. And Madison, like most of the founders, not all of them, but like most of them, is very sympathetic to Jewish religious liberty. And I think that would come from the Jewish participation in the war. Madison knows, as does Washington. Washington's got a Jew on his staff for a while. He knows that Jews are patriots. And that is what changes the world. And it really does. So that would be my answer. That the petition from Mikveh Israel, it's nice, but there's so much else going on in the same way that it's just one piece of it.
Well, I would point out with all due respect on that, is that Pennsylvania was significant as a state at that time. The Constitution is being written here, and the founders are here, all of them discussing the writing and the content of the Constitution. So it was important that our Sagan Vice President Haim Solomon and Jonas Phillips later were both involved in abolishing this religious test oath that was required to hold office. I would point out to you, for instance, that Haim Solomon was a Freemason. So he was a Freemason, he was Jewish, and yet he was able to become a Freemason. And that as far as we are concerned, and I respect your point on that, paramount that we were able to do this in Pennsylvania and abolish that oath on a Jewish Bible, and to have it on a Jewish Bible if the person running for office requested that, not just on a Christian Bible. This state, which has seen many Jewish governors and mayors, et cetera, it boasts itself all the way to that period when Congregation Mikveh was able to do that. I just didn't want it to underplayed in terms of how important that law was to make it even so that they could run for office, they could hold office. And where we have a Supreme Court today in Pennsylvania, and they're members of that Supreme Court who are Jewish, or governors and mayors, et cetera. And that contribution of the Jewish community in Pennsylvania is paramount. I have to tell you that we held for many years, and up to today, we hold hands with our sister congregation of Christ Church, which is not very far away from here, a half a block away. And they recognize the importance throughout the times of being partners in the establishment of religion in the United States and its freedom.
Thank you. So going off that, there's been some questions as well on anti-Semitism in early America. This could be in the colonial times or after the American Revolution. Aside from the prohibition on Jews being able to hold elected office or perhaps vote, are there actual instances of what we would call anti-Semitism? It seems those prohibitions were not solely directed at Jews. They prohibited a whole class of people, and Jews were included as not being of the dominant faith.
Sure. You can certainly find anti-Judaism attacks on Jews. I mean, a famous example, if we're in Pennsylvania, is the 1800 election. That election was a very stressful moment with Thomas Jefferson, and we see significant, really, anti-Semitism connected with that. There's a long article in Pennsylvania Magazine of History on that, and prejudice doesn't disappear just because laws change. And one can find cycles where anti-Jewish attacks will be made. There were also opponents of the idea that a Jew could hold high office. Patrick Henry was not very keen on that as a famous example. Later, another man who spent some time in Philadelphia, most of his time in New York, and is actually nephew of Jonas Phillips, Mordecai Noah. When Mordecai Noah runs for sheriff in New York in the 1820s, there is tremendous anti-Semitism. And his opponents say, look, a Jew may end up hanging Christians, to which one wise person at the time said, what kind of Christians are these who need hanging at all? But the very fact that the issue was raised is a reminder that anti-Semitism, an anachronistic term, that anti-Semitism doesn't disappear just because George Washington makes a guarantee and the Constitution promises religious liberty. It is something that Jews have continually to be vigilant for, and we need to remember that there's laws and then there are human beings. And while we may be very proud of the fine laws, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's been the practice. Anyone who reads 19th century American novels can find some very negative Jewish characters there. At the same time, it should be noted that Jews also gain rights that would have been unimaginable anywhere else in the world. And we have to hold both of those things together. It's not one or the other, it's both.
I think
Can
if I may,
can I add one thing to that, which is Jonathan mentions Patrick Henry as an example. Patrick Henry also vigorously opposed the Bill for Religious Freedom in Virginia. He hated James Madison, and Patrick Henry wanted Virginia to only support what had become the American Episcopal Church, having no longer the Anglican Church, but it was the same church. So I completely agree with everything Jonathan says. Bigotry is there. What Washington is saying and what the Constitution is saying, you give no sanction to bigotry. You give no support to bigotry. And that's what makes the American scene, starting in the 1760s, because what's fascinating, I mentioned all these people who signed non-importation petitions. The very fact that Christians were willing to let Jews sign their petitions is an important piece in New York, in Philadelphia, in Savannah, in Charleston, because they're saying we are accepting Jews as fellow patriots. And it's really, quite frankly, I can't imagine a similar kind of petition in England where the English petitioners would have wanted Jews to sign their petitions. So there's this conflict always. And anti-Semitism, by the way, is used by anybody who thinks they can get votes with it often. So that Federalists accuse the Jeffersonians of being pro-Jewish, and Jeffersonians accuse the Federalists of being pro-Jewish. Jews are a convenient tool for people who are bigots and running for office. By the way,
let me add to that.
one more thing. The Freemasons had often allowed Jews to join. They didn't let Catholics join. They hated the Catholics, but Jews could join because they weren't Catholic.
Let me just add to this kindly. What you have is the present population here saw very much the Jewish effort that was going on. If it was in finances by way of Chaim Solomon and Morris, and they also saw soldiers shoulder to shoulder, members of this congregation who fought, were injured, or died alongside them as against the British. When you see that, it changes the perspective of the people that perhaps you didn't understand at that time. You saw them as active participants and those who would lend a hand in every respect to George Washington and the founding of this country.
You can see an interesting example with Chaim Solomon. If you read the papers of Robert Morris, which have been published, in the beginning, he says, the Jew, Chaim Solomon, came to see me. Later on, Mr. Solomon came to see me. And that very subtle shift gives you a sense of how, as people came to know Jews, they came to respect Jews. And that certainly does happen more in Philadelphia, partly because Philadelphia, for a brief moment in the Revolution, is by far the largest center of the Jewish population in the United States. Then a lot of those people leave and Mikveh Israel's membership goes down. But during the Revolution, it is the largest Jewish center, and there's no doubt that those patriots who gathered to write the Constitution would, in the nature of things, have met Jews, and as Mr. Gabay says, some of them even took loans, including, as I recall, James Madison from Chaim Solomon. So I think one of them writes, we are indebted to, a double meaning of indebted. So it was very fortunate that we had a significant Jewish population in Philadelphia, but I think it would be a mistake to say that that inoculated the population against anti-Semitism. It doesn't work that way. And It didn't then, and it doesn't now. And Chaim Solomon himself appends a strong response to an anti-Semitic letter, really, that is written in the Philadelphia Press. The fact that Chaim Solomon responds means he's not frightened. In America, after the revolution, Jews can respond strongly. But nevertheless, there was this letter from one of his Quaker opponents that he had to answer. And in many ways, we see familiar themes that are going to recur throughout American Jewish history.
Let me just say this. There are 75 instances in congressional records in which Morris, who was appointed the superintendent of finance, writes these words: "I sent for Chaim Solomon," because the situation was so desperate financially. And when he said that he was providing George Washington's troops, there were troops who were members of this congregation holding weapons.
You know, I also want to add another way to understand this is, by the time of the American Revolution, you had a very new, important Jewish presence in America, represented by men such as Moses Michael Hayes. They are American born. They are Americans. And it's important that as the American Revolution takes place, you see by July 11th in 1776, Rhode Island now has an oath of loyalty request that it goes across both Christian and Jewish members of particularly Newport. Hayes is asked to come before the Rhode Island General Assembly and present and sign this oath. He objects to that because the oath requires that he sign that oath under the principles of Christianity. And he actually comes before the General Assembly, demands that he comes before the General Assembly, presents his own letter. And in that letter, he affirms his belief in the revolutionary cause, but he also states that he should be respected and all fellow Americans should be respected regardless of the religious differences. So what's important here is that you have this new Jewish presence that is not tied to the old world, but tied to being significant contributors and founders of the new world in the founding of America.
And let me say that it was a coming together of the Jewish communities. And Keith, I got to tell you, we welcomed all the Jews from Rhode Island right over here when the British ran you down here, and from New York. You were welcome then, and you're welcome today.
You're so right, Ellie, because unfortunately the disruption of the war, Newport by the end of the 18th century ceased to become a Jewish presence. Many of the Jews are relocating, some back to New York, many to Philadelphia, others such as the Hayes family are in Boston, and then a few others later become founding members of some of the Southern congregations, particularly Richmond, Virginia. But Newport itself, by the end of the 18th century, ceased to become a major Jewish contributor to early America.
Isaac, if I could add one more footnote to all of this, which is in discussing Jewish military participation, I mentioned officers because it's shocking that there are officers, that there are captains and lieutenant colonels and one colonel, that is really unheard of in the Western world. There probably, and Jonathan will correct me if I'm wrong, because he, after all, knows more about this than the rest of us combined. There were about 100 Jews who served in the Continental Army and the state militias. Given the small population, that's a lot. And it would have been an eye-opener for most soldiers because they would have said, I've never met a Jew before. And they were right. They had never met a Jew. They didn't see them anywhere. But I want to flip back a century earlier because Ali's point is much earlier than he thinks. In 1698, the government of what is now New York, no longer New Amsterdam, tells Osler Levy, who is, by the way, Osler Levy is one of the Jews who got there ahead of the 23 Jews from Recife, Brazil. So when the first Jews get off the boat, they're met by, the 3 or 4 other Jews who were already there, including Osler Levy and a guy named Solomon Peterson and a man named Jacob Bar Simpson. But Levy is levied with a tax for not standing guard. And Levy says, well, I won't, because you stood the guard. It was like the local police force. You had to do it once or twice a year. You walk around town with your blunderbuss. They don't, or I don't think they had muskets yet. And you're the night watchman. He said, well, of course I'll stand guard. And they said, well, Jews never stand guard. He says, well, I'm not paying the fine. I can't afford it. I will be the night watchman. He is the night watchman. The next year he shows up to vote. And they say, well, Jews can't vote. And he says, but I stand the night watch. So they let him vote. So this is the process that is beginning very early on, and it's very gradual. And by the way, it is the same process that African Americans will have during the American Civil War, because after 220,000 or so blacks serve in the US Army and Navy during the Civil War, it's very hard to say, oh, you can't vote. So this has always been a process of people who are marginalized. And what's interesting is the Jews are constantly pushing the envelope, which changes the revolution.
And as you know, when Jews petitioned in New York after the revolution, they noticed that they had shed blood for the revolution. And that becomes very important. The shedding of blood for the revolution legitimates the Jewish claims to be treated as equals after the revolution. And that story is going to be repeated, which is why Jews were so interested in keeping records on Jews who fought in America's wars.
And you can see the tombstones at 8th and Spruce in our cemetery there that we maintain. It's a national shrine, as I said. You can see the tombstones of those soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War.
And of course, New York has similar, there was pride in that fact. And just remember how different that is from, say, Russia in the same period, where Jews are impressed into service by Tsar Nicholas. They're going to run away. Going into the military means you can't maintain your religion, and the whole point of the military is to draw Jews away from their religion under Nicholas. So you really get a sense of some of the features that made the American experience different from that of the bulk of Jews in the larger Ashkenazi world, which is very interesting and helps to explain why later Jews are going to want to come to America. They've begun to hear these stories. Even Chaim Solomon's name gets back to Europe in one of the first responsa. The first shuvot that mentions America has to do with Chaim Solomon. So those ideas go back, and eventually, in our day, we see so many of the Jews coming to America, in a sense, as a response to some of what we've spoken about today.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a great place to finish today's event. It's been a fascinating and stimulating conversation. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone. Thank you to our 4 distinguished panelists and speakers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Michael, is there anything else?
What I would want to say is I would want to thank these distinguished guests, the speakers today, for really an amazing presentation. Our audience may forget that our mission is to tell the story of Sefarad, but the point is that the Sefarad legacy did make its way into the Americas, and that was the point of today's presentation and upcoming presentations about the influence of Sefarad on America. I also want to thank our audience for sticking with us for 2 hours. Clearly, it was interesting. Our next event is on July 24, same time, same place. See you all next time. Thank you, everyone.